Okay, I'm going to talk about voter ID laws, and this issue is kind of a hot button issue right now because perhaps of all the accusations from Trump about the 2020 election being fraudulent. Now, let's talk about voter ID laws, and we're going to talk about both the left wing and the right wing view on voter ID laws. So, first, though, what is a voter ID law? A voter ID law is a law that requires an ID to vote. In other words, you have to prove your identification to vote. Some states have voter ID laws and some states don't, right? More often than not, left-leaning states, blue states, are less likely to have voter ID laws, and vice versa, right? So, the right-wing argument, and perhaps the Republican argument, is that voter ID laws should be a requirement. In other words, you should have to require someone to prove their identity before they vote. And this makes sense, right? We want fair elections. We don't want fraudulent elections. We don't want people perhaps stealing the identity of somebody else and voting in their place. We don't want people voting twice. So it makes sense to require an ID at the ballot box. Checks out. It's a valid argument. On the other hand, the left wing will say that voter ID laws are perhaps racist or even classist. And what I mean by that, or what they mean by that, is that voter ID laws suppress the votes of people who have a harder time getting their hands on an ID, who have a harder time of acquiring an ID, right? And generally, that means minorities, okay? Because IDs cost money. IDs require you to prove your identification, right? And sometimes it's hard to get your hands on a birth certificate if you just immigrated to the country, perhaps, right? So, in other words, there is merit to the left-wing argument as well. We don't want to suppress democracy by suppressing the minority vote, and if we require minorities to acquire an ID, and those minorities are less likely to be able to get one, then we're suppressing the minority vote. That is suppressing democracy. So, in other words, if we require IDs to vote, we might suppress minority vote. But if we don't require IDs to vote, we might get fraudulent votes. So, in other words, both sides have a valid argument. Both sides are trying to protect democratic ideals, right? At least that's what it seems like. But there is one solution to this problem, and it's a very simple solution. All we have to do is, first of all, require IDs at the voting booth and give those IDs out to anybody who wants one for free, right? We have to make IDs free and easily accessible, and we have to require IDs at the ballot box. This should, in theory, make everybody happy, because now the Republicans get their voter ID laws that they wanted, and the minorities get the IDs that they need to vote, right? So why isn't this happening? Why are the Democrats and Republicans not coming to this consensus? Not coming up with this very simple solution to this problem? Well, I suspect it's because they're being disingenuous. I suspect both sides are being disingenuous. I suspect that the Republican Party knows that if you give minorities IDs, those minorities are going to vote more, and they're probably going to vote against Republicans. They're going to vote left-wing, right, by and large. Likewise, the Democrat side, the left-wing, knows that they know that they're probably getting some fraudulent votes due to the lack of voter ID requirements right now. So, again, I think both sides are being disingenuous. Now, I think perhaps the Republicans are being the right wing is being a little more disingenuous, because ultimately, I think if you required IDs to vote and you gave IDs to everybody, the Democrats would probably get a net benefit. And maybe they don't see that, or maybe they're trying. They probably are trying in certain places to make IDs free. But the bottom line is that we have to make IDs free from the top. We have to do it from a federal level, rather than depending on independent states to do it. If we want to uphold democratic values, if we want to stop suppressing democracy. Now, here's the thing though. Instead of talking about the easy solution that I provided, we have the media going off and creating division in regard to this voter ID issue. I saw a Rush Limbaugh clip. Rush was talking about he was basically accusing the Democrats of trying to create racial division by insinuating that racial minorities, couldn't afford IDs or weren't smart enough to get IDs. obviously there are plenty of minority people who know how to get IDs, right? There's plenty of black people and Hispanic people with IDs. It's not the Democrats, the left wing isn't insulting those minorities, saying they're too stupid to get IDs. And this is what Rush Limbaugh was implying, which is just bullshit. That's not what the left wing is saying. What the left wing is saying is that minorities are less likely to be able to get their hands on IDs. And that's a statement of fact. If I were to say that obesity is unhealthy, that's a statement of fact. No one in their right mind would argue with that statement. However, I'm not making a claim against the character of obese people. I'm not attacking the character of people who happen to be obese. I'm just making a statement of fact. Rush Limbaugh is basically saying that because obesity is unhealthy, and I stated that obesity is unhealthy, he's stating that I hate obese people and I think they're stupid. So those are two different things, right? He is basically taking a fact and making it into an emotional argument. Minorities aren't stupid because they can't get their hands on IDs. They're not lesser people because they can't afford an ID. It just is what it is. Just because most minorities can get IDs doesn't mean there isn't a disproportionately larger number of minorities who can't get IDs. And all we have to do, again, free IDs, tax-funded IDs, make them easily accessible, and you got a solution to the problem. Again, why aren't the Republican and Democrat Party coming to this solution? It's because I don't think they want that solution. I think ultimately they're perhaps trying to suppress democratic values across the board. And there are other examples of that too. We have all this gerrymandering of voting districts, right? They draw these zigzaggy lines through all of the various population centers in states in order to kind of sway the voting in those districts in certain directions, right? Beyond that, you have states shutting down polling locations. So next thing you know, 4 years ago, maybe you drove 15 minutes to vote. Now you got to drive an hour and a half or whatever, and you got to wait in line for 2 hours just to vote. The point here is that there are many examples of our government suppressing democracy, and they are not taking common sense solutions to represent us. So why is that? What are we doing wrong? You have to ask yourself that question. And if all of your answers come down to blaming one side or the other, you're not paying attention. This Republican-Democrat uniparty we have, this duopoly, is not on your team, okay? At least the elite Democrats and the elite Republicans. The average Republican or Democrat on your street is closer, has more in common with you than any politician that we have elected, okay? If you're a Democrat and your neighbor's a Republican, you have more in common with that person than any Democrat in office. You have to understand this, because if you don't, you're going to miss that uniparty that's been developing, that has been increasingly suppressing democracy to your detriment and to the benefit of the politicians and the elite. What we need to do is we need to take control of this government. The government, the biggest examples I can think of this democratic suppression is essentially taxation without representation on a large scale via the military-industrial complex, the pharmaceutical-industrial complex, the food-industrial complex, the healthcare-industrial complex. All of these industries, the military, the healthcare, pharmaceutical, and the food industry, they're all intertwined with each other. And it starts with the food, okay? If we eat unhealthy food, we become unhealthy. If our government funds and regulates poorly the food industry, we eat junk food, we become unhealthy. Then we go into the healthcare industry to look for ways to solve that poor health, and we pay the pharmaceutical industry to solve that poor health. Before long, we are broke, and we pay taxes, and because we're broke, because we're sick, we believe that we have to fight the rest of the world. And that's where the military-industrial complex comes in. It's all connected. All of those four industries are basically a way to keep us stupid, sick, unhealthy, and complacent. And when we don't recognize that corruption, it corrupts us. It corrupts our own ability to think, and we become so divided amongst ourselves that we forget all the similarities that you have with your neighbor. So my advice is to stop voting for Democrats and Republicans. Start voting for third parties, independents, libertarians, Green Party. I don't even care. Vote for yourself if you want. Start to put your vote out there in a way that shows that you are sick of the duopoly. We need on election night, you need the other category that isn't Republicans and Democrats. You need that other category to become significant. It needs to be 10%, then 15%, then 20%, then 25%. And over time, as the number of people who truly believe that the country is not working for you, as those people actually show communicate their discontent in the election by voting for those third parties, you fix the problem. Right now, most of the country believes that only a Democrat and Republican can win. And the only way that changes is by voting for other people, so that the people who do vote based on the polls will start to believe that a third party can win. You have to vote third party. And if you're still stuck in that tribal mindset, if you're still a Republican or Democrat, you'll figure it out. I'm not shaming you. There's no shame here. I'm not blaming you. There's nothing like that. I just want you to see that in the long term, you'll catch on to this pattern. You'll figure out that these two parties are just, as they say, they're left and right wing on the same bird, right? So again, don't fall for this voter ID culture war. The solution is simple. The solution will make any person happy that actually believes in democracy. But if you don't believe in democracy, you don't want easy solutions. You want culture wars and division, and that's what they're doing. So thanks for watching.